you'll see half a dozen icons pop up. You go to participants, click participants, which shows some like silhouettes, 6. You click participants, and on the right-hand side of your screen, at the top is the participants, at the bottom at choices you can make, and the first one says raise hand, and there's a little blue hand.
I see
like
it.
It's waving, okay? So you click, I'm going to click my blue hand here.
And what do I see?
Well, the problem is that we need to have a moderator to see that. Where's Janice?
Janice is, I can see your blue hand lit on the little participants thing.
Okay, there you go. You can see it there. Because typically the moderator would run the meeting and the moderator would see the hands immediately.
Okay. No, I think Janice is not going to stick around. She's going to go away and then come back, I think, when Bill Kelly tries to come in.
Okay. To make it easier in the future, you name a co-moderator, and then she can click share screen, and she could make you, Deb, the co-moderator, okay? And then you can recognize the hands and let people in and mute people and unmute them and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, since Lowry, you can't raise your hand since we have your formal portrait up, I'll keep an eye out on the little screen doohickey there. Okie doke. So if you feel comfortable using the button to raise your hand, I'll try to keep my eye on that. But if you want to just wave, that's fine with me. I can see your hand.
Is John coming over?
I don't know. He hung up, so I bet he is.
Okay.
How I think we're going to do this is I'm going to let Lowry, once we know where John is, introduce the growth management article, since he's the author of that. We have had a couple of conversations with Bill Kelly about it, and Bill has some recommendations and some things that he would like to discuss regarding the growth management. You all have a copy of his version of it. So Bill Kelly is going to join us. So I thought once Lowry, if this is okay with you, Lowry, once you've introduced and gone through the growth management article, if you want to, turn it over to Bill to give his point of view, what do you think? Would that work?
Oh, sure.
Okay, Karen, you've raised your hand.
No, that's all right. I was just asking where John was.
Oh, okay. And then we will, I don't know how long that discussion will go. It may go on a little while. Then we need to set or try to come up with a next meeting date and time, and then maybe look at some of the other articles we put in the packet. Does that sound okay with everybody?
Sounds good.
Okay. Oops, somebody's there and it's Bill.
Hello, everybody.
Bill joined us. Great. John is either on his way to Karen's or still trying to sign on. He's having some technical difficulties. So glad you're with us, Bill. As you know, we're live and we're on YouTube. So let's just get started. Go ahead, Lowry. You want to talk about Article 7, growth management and long-range planning?
Okay. Deb and Jean and I worked on this March, April time period. And we looked at some examples and felt it was important to continue to have this in the charter, but also tried to make it fairly consolidated. So it's only, I think, a page and a half long. And some of this was trying to get, no?
No,
okay.
Go ahead. I think John's coming.
Okay. Some of this was to try to do what we've done with the rest of the charter, which is to make sections only deal with specific areas or tasks and not have overlap that goes through multiple sections describing the same activity. And we got this to Bill originally in late March, early April. He did some revisions that we'll talk about in a minute that were largely correcting some things we didn't understand about the law with different references and things like that. And then there's also some things that are more, I guess we could call them more political decisions or more decisions that we could discuss as a group and see which direction we want to go. So the first thing we did was address.
Thank you.
Okay. Misty bringing you dinner?
Not yet. That'll be a little bit later.
Okay.
She's got her little gear on though.
Okay. The first thing we did was address how the planning board is assembled. So we went with the 5 members, which we currently have, serve staggered 3-year terms, and 2 alternates that serve 1-year terms. We did add the part that says planning boards must be Camden residents, because that was never there before. And Chris McLean and I found out with a conversation with Bill, I don't know, 8 years ago, maybe, that there was no requirement to be a Camden resident to be on a planning board. We thought it was pretty important that you live here to be on the planning board, but that's certainly something we can discuss. And then the duties and responsibilities are as follows. One is review and process all the various applications. We try to list all the applications. And we said other land permitting requirements as stipulated in the zoning and subdivision ordinances. We felt that that gave us cover if 3 years from now there's some new plan review process that's added to the zoning and subdivision ordinances. We don't have to address it separately with the charter, because the charter says whatever's in the ordinances, that's what the planning board deals with. And then the second part was, where appropriate, initiate amendments to existing ordinances, which is something the planning board has done for a very long time, because frequently they're the closest to those kind of events, and they talk to engineers and property owners, and I think that they can more easily get a sense of when it might be time to look at some things and discuss whether or not changes are appropriate. At what point do we want to have little discussions about this, Deb?
Well, maybe since you've gone through A, find out if anybody has any feedback on that section, sort of do it section by section. That might be a good way to do it.
Okay, anybody have any comments on A?
No, I'm good.
I'm good.
Okay. Bill, you're good with A? Bill is muted right now. Can he be
Bill?
unmuted?
You're muted.
There we go.
I'm
Okay.
I'm trained to mute until I'm speaking, having been on so many of these. No, I have no issues. I think what you have in A1, A, and B are exactly what you always do. So it's really just reinforcing prior law and practice.
Okay.
Looks like John may have joined us. John,
I'm here.
great.
I made it on my phone. I couldn't do it on my computer.
Well, that's okay. We have just we're looking at growth management and long-range planning, and Lowry has just discussed section A, which just describes the planning board and its basic duties.
Okay, I'm listening.
Okay. What did you have any comments on A, John, or are you okay with that?
For the moment, I'm fine. I'll listen to the, keep going.
Okay. B, on the zoning ordinance, the planning board needs to be aware of what's going on, kind of both in terms of what's going on with the town and what's going on with the world in terms of new ways of viewing land development ordinances. And we want to make sure that any zoning ordinance has to be consistent with the comp plan, which says, is that on state law, Bill?
I should probably stay unmuted. It is, that's the language in the statute, although I'm really focused on pursuant to before. I'll have to think about that. The first part of that, just before it says inconsistent with, but the consistent with is exactly right out of the statute.
Okay. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me you always told me that consistent with means really not inconsistent.
Basically, I'll go all the way to the end zone and say, as long as the comprehensive plan doesn't prohibit something, it's probably permissible to put it in an ordinance.
Okay. So that's,
Can
yeah,
I
that's,
intervene?
Is that John?
May I say something, ask something?
Sure.
Bill, can I speak, Deb?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I was always under the impression in the years past that the comp plan was more of a guide for the community. It wasn't the ordinance of the law of the land, so to speak. Is that true, Bill?
It is true, and that's why what I just said was, unless something expressly in the comp plan prohibits language in a ordinance, then that ordinance is going to be going to control over the comp plan, and that's appropriate because the comp plan it's a policy and a big picture kind of discussion guide, and I have never had a case where even though planning boards review applications and make sure they're consistent with the comp plan, I've never had a case where the comp plan was raised as a defense, which it frequently is, but I've never had the case where the comp plan language was ruled to by a court to prohibit what the voters had adopted in an ordinance. So totally in concert with what you're saying, John, the power, all the real guts of what goes on in terms of the law of the town will be found in ordinances. Comp plan is a guide.
Right, and that's, I was always told in the past that it was considered a living document, so to speak, of people's will as time goes on. So would it make sense to make it a permanent, I don't want to say a charter amendment, because it's always going to be changing as time goes on, correct?
Right, and I don't think Lowry's trying to say that the comp plan stays, it becomes inflexible. He's just saying that zoning ordinances are going to have to be consistent with it, which is exactly what the statute says. So there's nothing new here, nothing new.
And in section C, it discusses how the comp plan can be changed from time to time when it's appropriate to do that.
Okay, I think I got what you're saying. I'm just trying to grasp all this. Thank you for.
Well, I think some of it too, John, is on a practical level. For the comprehensive plan to list every activity that's allowed in a zone would be next to impossible. I mean, you could have thousands of activities. Are shoe stores okay? Well, what about dress stores? Well, what about stores that sell stationery? You know, you can't list all that stuff. It's really much easier to list things that you do not want to allow in certain areas of the town.
So do we have any issue with that language in the last sentence in B1A? Oh, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. The zoning ordinance must be pursuant to and consistent with. The consistent with is okay. I'm not really sure what pursuant to, is that any different than consistent with? Is that sort of a question for you, Bill?
Well, if I had my druthers, because we have a significant body of case law to know what consistent with means. I just had a case last year in Belfast where with the salmon farm issue, and the lawsuit challenged the ability of the legislature in Belfast, which is a city council, to amend the zoning ordinance. And we spent an awful lot of energy on what consistent with means. But pursuant to, we don't have any case law on that. So having focused on this a little bit, if when you go back and mess with this a little bit more, meaning carefully edit, I might take out pursuant to.
Okay, I'll circle that with a question mark then. Okay.
Okay.
B2 on the zoning map requirement. I believe this is right out of state statutes that the town has to have a zoning map. It's got to be signed and dated by the select board. And when from time to time it may be amended, then the new amended zoning map must be signed and dated by the select board.
We do actually have a case that goes back to like 1986 or 1987, where we didn't have a signed zoning map. And so somebody was able to build a house taller than the zoning ordinance height limit because the zoning map was theoretically not in force because it hadn't been signed by the select board. So the house is taller than the maximum height limit, and that was allowed to stand as of through a lawsuit.
Oh,
So we kind of learned that the hard way.
Yeah, I think this is one of those many requirements out there that for some reason was overlooked. I think the mistake was nothing more than that. I don't think there was anything intentional.
No.
I don't have a problem with that either, Deb. I think it's fine.
Okay.
On the comprehensive plan, we've had multiple discussions with Bill on this, because one of the things that's happened is when the SPO was disbanded, the state went from requiring comprehensive plans to allowing comprehensive plans. And so this is something we want to have a discussion about, I think, while we're in the midst of it. The language that we've come up with so far is that the planning board shall develop and maintain a comp plan every 10 years, or as often as called for in state law, shall be thoroughly reviewed and amended or rewritten by the planning board. And then further, the planning board shall solicit information from a broad range of citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, town committees, whatnot. And then from time to time, it may be appropriate to amend the comp plan to satisfy changes in state or federal regulations or to reflect changes in how Camden citizens want to direct the town in between the normal activities. And if that's the case, the planning board is not going to hash it out with wherever this change is coming from, make those recommended changes suggested to the select board for their consideration of inclusion at the next town meeting. In my experiences, that most of the changes or the amendments that were made to the comp plan along the way were the result of directions from the state, where the state made some specific recommendations or changing that they wanted us to put into the comp plan, as opposed to citizens' interest or other people in town saying, gee whiz, wouldn't it be good if we could do A, B, and C in this particular zone? But that could certainly change. One of the discussions that we had with Bill is that, correct me if I misstate this, Bill, but because the state no longer requires the comprehensive plan, that there was a discussion of whether or not we strike the language that says the town shall develop and maintain, as opposed to the town may develop and maintain. Is that correct, Bill? Is that
Right. And what I had suggested was that you just mirror the state statute, which is now a permissive sentence that a town may adopt a comp plan instead of shall. It probably doesn't much matter in Camden because you're going to have one. But at least it would be consistent with the state statute. You may want to go beyond that and require it. I don't know that anybody will really care, but I just pointed that out for continuity with the state statute.
Can I?
Bill, is it correct that towns are allowed to have ordinances that are more stringent than state ordinances, but not more liberal than state ordinances?
There are very few, but there certainly are some state ordinances that are what we call a minimum mandatory ordinance: subdivision law, shoreline zoning, certain things to do with other sort of shoreland intertidal issues. But by and large, the state does not care if the local municipality adopts more stringent review criteria, as long as they are at least as stringent as the state has required.
So if this commission were to embrace shall doing a new comp plan, and it was ultimately voted on by the voters and approved, the state would not have an objection to that.
Well, there's nothing unlawful about you making it mandatory that the town of Camden have a comp plan. That's permissible.
Okay. Because when Deb and Jean and I were discussing this, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, whenever it was, one of the things we talked about is that we felt that it was really important to the town of Camden to have a comp plan where we got a lot of citizen involvement and involvement from committees and town staffers, clubs and organizations that were active in town. So I think that that's why the three of us were leaning towards shall rather than may, but I think that this is probably a good point of conversation for the gang tonight.
And let me add one thing, because this is a common theme. Remember that your charter is akin to a constitutional document. It's important for it to state things that matter, but it's also important for there to be flexibility for the future. So if I was going to take a counterpoint to your using mandatory language here, I would say that by inserting the language into Article 7 that says that you expect to, so to speak, have a comp plan, here's who will be on it, here's what the kinds of things that are required in terms of how you amend it. It at least gives, if the word may is used to have one instead of shall, it does give flexibility for the future. I can't imagine what it would be, but then I can't imagine what's going to happen in 50 years. Regionalization, compartmentalization, in terms of how different areas in Camden develop, I don't know. But the watchword for charters is to not put the flavor of the day into the document to restrict the future as a general rule with all things, and provide a framework, but flexibility for changes. Think of all the things that happened with the US Constitution in terms of the challenges. And my gosh, it's an imperfect document. Look at all the stuff that they haven't sorted out that should have been in there. And the counter argument, which is probably the prevailing argument, is, well, it really would be a awful cumbersome document if it was mandatory law of the land, inflexible, didn't change with the times, and we treated it like a statute instead of a constitution. So that's my counterpoint for your discussion and consideration, is the more flexibility you have in the future once you identify the issues in the process, to me is the scope of what you should be looking at. You get too specific with any one process, you've sort of handcuffed people for the future. And the voters will vote on things, they'll pass ordinances, they'll amend ordinances, and you don't want to have to say, whoops, we can't do that because the charter says we can't. You have to try to anticipate that. Where would the whoops be, where somebody might want to bring something forward and deal with it politically in the day, in the time. That's a long-winded commentary, but that's sort of the argument as to why you'd keep it may instead of shall, although I can't see how you'd never have a comp plan in Camden. So there you go.
Yeah.
Two sides
John?
of the same argument.
John,
Yes, couple
Will you-
comments
were you about to comment?
if I may.
Please.
One thing, in the past, we've always had it started out originally as a committee by the citizens, correct? It was always the comp plan was designed to be a citizens committee. I know that we've had difficulties over the years finding citizens to stay involved with it, so they end up involving to a planning board committee. But I think it still should start as a citizens committee. Not put in the document as a planning board committee, because I think the first effort should be to make it like I said, it's a people's document. That's what it's supposed to be. The other thing is, I would really like to have a conversation with Jeremy Martin or Steve Wilson on the negative side of doing this as a charter amendment, including the implementation program. I'd like to have their opinion, if we could sometime include them in this conversation. That's all I have on that for now.
I think that's a really good idea. I mean, just like Lowry has had a couple of conversations with Jody regarding the financial procedures section, I think that that's a very good idea. I would love us to have sort of some kind of a consensus of what we'd like to have them review and talk about. But I think that's, I mean, it's just like, I'm trying to get the personnel board to weigh in on what we're talking about as far as the changes to the personnel board and how that section is written. So I think that's a really good idea, John.
So I think, have they seen this document at this point? Either
No,
one?
no, because you guys hadn't seen it either. Before,
So-
this goes to anybody else, we all sort of ought to have some kind of consensus, if we can, on what we think is the best thing to have in here. So no, they
I would
haven't
love
seen
to
it.
see, I would love to see that. I know it's a draft at this point, because we are still having a conversation about this. But I would love to see Jeremy and Steve look at this and give us their opinion in a Zoom meeting at the next, hopefully a live face-to-face meeting would be great. But the next meeting to maybe get their opinion on the downfalls of going in a certain direction or not.
What do you
You
guys
understand?
think? I mean, I'm okay with that.
I am
Okay,
Hmm?
I think that's a good idea.
Mr. Hurd?
I was just going to comment on John's comment about who should be involved with the comprehensive plan. We had this discussion, John, when you and I were on the board together, and it sort of fell to the planning board because we felt as if anyone knows about what goes on in town with regard to ordinances and so forth, it's the planning board and it's not Joe and Betty Citizen.
if I may, Deb?
Yes, John.
Jim, I know we've had difficulties finding citizens to be engaged in this, but we do have some very talented people out there that are great in different areas of the comp plan or the community. We should take advantage of that. But I think the first thing we should do is at least offer it to the citizen base And then, do the normal committee assignments, try to see if anybody's interested. If not, then we'll need to go back to the planning board. But I think it still needs to start with a citizens offer. I mean,
What, I don't disagree with
disagree with
that
either.
premise, but as I recall, it sort of fell apart, and that's when the planning board picked it up, because the citizens group, as I recall, they weren't together to make this happen.
I agree, but go ahead.
There would be a way to write this section of it that talks about the planning board being the base of the comprehensive plan committee, but not having to be the whole comprehensive plan committee. Karen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was about to agree with John on this. The reason being what Bill Kelly said earlier, even though we can't or haven't been able to in the past find citizen committees to pull together, that doesn't mean that it's going to be that way in the future.
Lowry?
Yeah, a couple things. The last time we did the comp plan, the request went out to the folks in town, and there were 3 people that volunteered, Karen, Jean, and Anita. And that was it. And after waiting a few more months for some other people to raise their hands, it was basically decided that the planning board would take over the comp planning responsibilities. And during that period of time, we solicited and received help from lots of other people in town. I mean, Robin McIntosh wrote the whole downtown section herself because we felt she had good skills in that area. She understood it well. She was willing to spend the time and did it. And quite frankly, we're getting away from the topic here because you've already skipped to section D. And I would like we should finish talking about section C first.
Okay, so
D is the population. Who populates the comp plan committee? One of the things that John said on C is to talk to Jeremy and Steve about this, because we want to have citizen involvement. Because we want to have citizen involvement, that's expressly the reason why we said we must have a comp plan, not may have a comp plan. Because what has happened with the most recent comp plan, which is now probably pushing 3 years old, is it's just disappeared and it's just collecting dust. And honestly, when I talked to Audra about that, I said, what's happening? Why don't we have a comp plan implementation committee? Her response was, oh, Jeremy's handling that. And I said, it's just, there's too many issues in there for one person to handle all the time. So I think that this is the way it's written now is to keep the focus on the citizen involvement, which has always been very important for Camden, to have as many citizens as possible involved in these very large tasks and conversations, and to not have them relegated to staff.
Deb?
yes, John.
I think Larry's not wrong, but I think the other thing is we still need to offer it first to the citizens. I think that's the intention of it. That's always been the intention of it. I agree we've had difficulties in the past, but we need to continue that because we don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And I don't want to see it become cast in stone that we're going to go to the planning board or that way. But I really would like to hear Jeremy's and Steve's thoughts on unintended consequences, and they work with us every day. I'm not saying that we don't go your path, Larry, but I would like to hear their thoughts before we go much further down that road.
Well, let's keep our options open then on, we're talking about C1, what the makeup is of a comprehensive plan committee. And so we'll keep our options open and our minds open until we have a chance to get some feedback from staff. How's that sound?
Great, I agree.
Okay, what you're talking about is D1, not C1. C1 is what?
No, I think we're still talking about C. I think, John, aren't you talking about the comprehensive plan committee,
I
not
am.
the implementation committee?
Yeah, that's
Correct. I
D.
am. I'm talking
D
about
is in
C1.
dog.
Yeah,
Pardon?
John was talking about C as in cat.
See number 1.
Okay, sorry, I misspoke.
That's all right. All right.
Well, if we're going to go to the citizens versus the planning board, I would like to add back in and encourage a broad range of opportunities for public comment.
Where are you?
The third line on number 1.
C1, I'm in the third sentence.
Okay.
The planning board
third
shall
line.
solicit and encourage participation from.
Yeah, I think encouraging is a very important thing if we're trying to get more than 3 citizens to be involved.
But,
And I
but
don't,
isn't
did
that,
Bill take encourage out? Is that,
Well,
No, I'm not seeing it.
yeah, it bills, you've got the planning board shall solicit a broad range of broad range of, ooh, that doesn't work grammar. broad range of
Conservation
public
Plan
comment.
Committee? Deb,
Yep,
Deb, what if you just write Conservation Plan Committee at this time? That covers the base, no matter who it is, versus the planning board at this point.
well, that's an interesting idea. So we'll keep those options open on the makeup of the comp plan committee.
Okay, thank you.
Just to explain why I put in a broad range of opportunity for public comment and review, that is right out of the statute, and that is the
Oh.
guiding principle of what must happen. However it happens, it must happen in a comp plan review. So I just,
Okay.
it's just co-opted that language. I wasn't really trying to remove encourage, except that it's sort of a soft word in this formal document. But you could put it back in. There's no harm in it.
Yeah, shall solicit and encourage a broad range of opportunity.
Sure.
Deb,
Yes, John.
isn't that how we do it now, though? It's typical, we go department heads, look, especially the different areas as we go through the articles of the comp plan, and we go to citizens, business folks, and we
Yep.
try to get as much information we can from the general public before we
Right.
make any decisions. That's what we do
Right.
now.
Right. But, so are you saying we don't need that language in there, or?
I'm not saying we don't at this point. I really still would like to know what the staff thoughts of unintended consequences along with Bill, and then we'll reapproach that at a different time.
Sure. Okey doke.
That's,
Shall we
that's-
move on to, yes,
that's C number 1 we just finished talking about, right?
yes. Shall we move on to
Yes.
C2? C as in cat.
Mhm.
Lowry.
Yeah, this is, as we discussed from time to time between the 10-year intervals, there may be a need to change the comp plan. Most frequently during my experience, it was to include changes in language or new language that the state added and wanted us to have in the comp plan. Whether or not the state's still going to issue us guidelines, since they don't have an SPO or not, I don't know. But I think we should have room in there to amend the document from time to time as needs develop.
And I think Bill's major comment on this, Bill, you can jump in. You say recommend the changes as opposed to make changes. Is that correct on 2, the line 3?
Yes, I think fairly strongly about that the planning board should not be making changes. They should be recommending them.
Would you read how you think it should go, Bill?
Well, the language in this section talks about from time to time, it may be appropriate to amend the comp plan to satisfy changes in state or federal regulations, or to reflect changes in how Camden citizens want to direct the town in between the normal 10-year cycle, period. In those cases, the planning board shall recommend changes. What the language had been was to say that the planning board shall make changes after soliciting input as described above from the public. So this was, to me, a bit inconsistent with state statute and very strong for the planning board to have the authority to make changes to the comp plan all by itself. And maybe I was being too literal, but a planning board's role in such things should be to recommend for the legislative body, not to make.
That makes sense, Deb. I think that does.
It does.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I think that works too. I mean, we have to make recommendations to the select board, who then has to decide to send it to the town meeting.
Right.
So it's all a proposed change to the comp plan at that point anyway. D, Lowry, you want to keep going?
D, one of the items that's been, I think, discussed for many years is that we have a comp plan and then it just sits on a shelf and gathers dust. There's usually lots of recommendations and questions and gee whiz, should we think about this later kind of language in there that is rarely addressed. And typically the only time people go to the comp plan is during a rezoning or something like that to see whether or not it's allowed or disallowed under the comp plan. So our feeling was when we wrote the comp plan, when we put it into the introduction, that there should be a implementation committee basically to keep an eye on all of these recommendations in the comp plan and from time to time nudge certain committees and say, so have you worked on this yet? You know, what are your priorities? And in fact, I met with Audra the day after it was announced that she'd been appointed as town manager. And the first question she asked me was, do you have a comp plan implementation committee? And I said, no, but it's in the introduction to be proposed. That committee would have to be formed by the select board. That committee has not yet been formed by the select board. So again, I think this is a way to keep citizens still involved and to make sure that these recommendations are at least looked at occasionally. We had a lot of discussions with Bill as to how to structure the language because it was really important that any of these changes that involve multiple departments come from the town manager. And I think that that's what a lot of the changes we're trying to include is to make sure that it was clear that while this implementation committee would kind of keep an eye on things, review things, and make recommendations from time to time, that any direction to make priority changes among departments or committees to work on certain tasks ahead of other tasks would be at the direction of the town manager. So that's why you see a lot of crossouts and rewritten sections in the D parts.
Bill, do you want to comment on the implementation section?
Well, Lowry touched on it. I was significantly concerned when I read that it was going to be mandatory that the select board was required to appoint a comprehensive plan implementation committee and that they would have authority to do the kinds of things that the town manager plan and the rest of the charter requires to be done sort of internally from an administrative perspective. And I made the comment that while that at times is frustrating and perhaps inefficient because obviously different folks are going to have different priorities all over town in terms of what should be worked on based on the goals of a comprehensive plan, because there's lots of goals. And a lot of those goals or those focus points are identified by statute in terms of what should be in a comp plan. And there's a lot of stuff in there. So people will have different opinions on what should be done. My concern was that you didn't want to get too far such that an implementation committee could override the select board or the town manager because neither the implementation committee would not be subject to the cumbersome, slow, but best practice of the political process, which of course is one where you gather energy, you present to the select board, you have people who wish to do something, you show that it's current and that there's support behind it, and they do that by speaking and sort of presenting themselves to the elected officials who are subject to being voted out of office if they don't respond to those issues. And that to me is an important part of a charter, by keeping those elected responsible for the results. And I understand Lowry's frustration, and I get that. And I think it's the same everywhere because the appetite of the comp plan exceeds the ability of the town to digest it, I think, most of the time. But what has happened with the edit here was to do two things. One was to say that the select board would have permissive authority. It could or could not appoint a comprehensive plan implementation committee. And secondly, in the next subpart, it could identify what portion or issues that the committee would focus on. And that would make some sense to me because let's face it, an elected select board is going to have different priorities from time to time. That's why people get elected. And that perhaps is the platform they've run on. So those are the current issues, and that current select board, elected officials, would identify the scope, perhaps, of what parts of the comp plan to chew on and to digest, and then direct that committee in a more focused way to do their work in concert with the select board's goals. And that's pretty important because, again, they're the elected officials, they're subject to the ballot box, because they can't do it all. And my concern was, and then the manager, of course, is extremely important in implementing the select board's policy directives. And that person can't do everything in terms of whatever some other group, such as an implementation committee, might demand of the manager. And those demands might be different than what the select board is demanding. And then they, of course, are elected officials and subject to the ballot box. So I was concerned about there being too much authority in an appointed body that was not subject to the political process. It might be efficient, but we want all the horses sort of pulling in the same direction so that the select board, this implementation committee, and the manager are all pulling in the same direction for the issues that need to be addressed. So I put, in my view, sort of a little bit of a break on some of this, which was fine for discussion in terms of the way it came out of the chute, but I've tried to damp it down a bit as I just described.
That seems to make sense to me, and I certainly understand about where the authority lies and where the responsibility lies, ultimately with the select board. I have a question on D1, where you say, consistent with 30A MRS 4324, the select board may appoint. So does the state statute not mandate an implementation committee, but says, so that's right from the state statute that the
Right, I believe
town-
it's permissive, right?
it's permissive in the state statute.
Yeah, this is, I haven't seen one of these elsewhere. So this would be the first one I've worked with, but I've only worked with probably, I don't know, 25 or 30 towns, but I'm sure it might be a practice elsewhere. But no, there's nothing mandatory. You don't even have to have the comp plan. That's not
Right, okay.
mandatory. So it all follows.
Deb,
Yes,
John.
who's that? Oh,
John.
John.
Of course. I have two comments. First place, does the review that we have now when we go through applications, the planning board reviews, code officer, we have the planning board, we have a town attorney that review to see if it's consistent with the comp plan. The other thing is that bothers me is we've always strived that an applicant, when it comes to the planning board, knew what they were expect to bring forward to the planning board when they were doing whatever their project was. Now you're saying is that they could bring something to the planning board, try to meet all of the requirements of that time, and then this committee could say in their interpretation of the comp plan that no, you can't do that. Is that true or not?
John, I think you're completely to the left. You're not reading what this says. What this says is in the comprehensive plan, at the back of every chapter, there's a whole list of questions, recommendations, and strategies, where the writers of those chapters said, here's additional things we need to think about in the future. You know, should we add traffic? Should we add trees? Should we change streetlights? Whatever. It's all these kind of, these are things we should study going forward to try to make Camden a better town. It's got nothing to do with subdivision or site plan approval at all. These are food for thought for later dates. It would be the implementation committee's job to keep an eye on these things and say, okay, the comp plan said we should think about whether or not we want to, I'm going to just make something up, remove some parking spaces on Main Street. Okay. So if the way Bill's got it written now, and I agree with having authority with select board and town manager kind of thing, is if the select board says, yeah, we think that would be a good thing to look at that task, you know, should we remove parking spaces wherever? The comp plan implementation committee can look at that and say, okay, the comprehensive plan committee identified 4 different groups that are involved in that. You know, how will the town manager direct getting them involved? It's got nothing to do with individual site plan approval or subdivision approval.
Okay. I'm just concerned that, because there's unintended consequences we don't know about. That's why I'd like to have Steve and Jeremy kind of weigh in. I think it'd be a good conversation to see what we're not thinking about, you know? I'm not saying you're wrong,
Sir,
Laura, I just would like to go a little further.
You're concerned that the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee may have some authority over site plan review?
Or any planning board decision, because
I
they
don't-
could,
No.
maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong.
You're wrong. That's
I don't
not even
Okay,
close.
That's
Calm
fine.
down.
I'm not, I would just like to hear Jeremy's and Steve's thoughts. Okay, leave it at that.
absolutely. Bill, do you read this as giving the Comp Plan Implementation Committee any authority over other planning board decisions? In like site plan or subdivision review or?
No,
Okay, well, I'm sorry if I got led astray.
Well,
Won't be the
no,
first time.
we will get their input on this whole article, so don't worry about that, John.
Okay, that's fine. I'm good.
Comments on the implementation? Karen, any thoughts about the implementation section?
No, ma'am, I do not at this time.
Okay,
So going back to the membership, D membership, the select board may or shall appoint. Where are we on that now?
I don't know if, I think, are we still keeping that open, sort of waiting feedback from?
Okay, so we're waiting for feedback on D1 as well. Okay. I'm just taking minutes, so I'm trying to.
Thank you, Jean.
And I think, Gene, one of the things that's important is that it needs to match up whether we may or shall have a comprehensive plan.
Exactly.
Because if we may have a comprehensive plan, it seems to make little sense to say that we shall have an implementation committee, because there might not be a plan to implement.
Right. Right.
Jim Hurd. Any
I'd
more
like
comments?
to follow up with Gene and just say, I think that if we're trying to do something, it's like the word encourage. I think shall has a lot more import than may. May says, well, maybe we'll do it and maybe we won't. Shall sort of forces our hand to have this implementation committee. Those are my comments on that section.
All right. Larry, I have a question for you. What do you think of the changes in language or the recommendations that Bill's made in D2, simplifying, not being quite as specific as the original draft?
I think Bill's recommendations make sense there. That clearly the implementation committee doesn't have authority to direct other people of the town, whether they be staff or committees, to do certain tasks. That's not their job. Their job is to kind of, keep an eye on the comprehensive plan, and maybe from time to time have a discussion with the select board and say, what do you think? Should we be going in this direction? And to work cooperatively with the select board and try to reprioritize as things change in town and as new people are elected. And then at some point, the select board may choose to go to the town manager and say, we think it's time we worked on this set of tasks. How do you want to proceed with this?
Yeah, I'm happy with Bill's recommendations on 2 and 3. Excuse me. Any other comments on that?
No, I'm all set.
No, me too. I'm
So
fine.
it looks like if everybody, we have a consensus that what if we create sort of an annotated version of this that talks about what the options are? For instance, the option on C1, may or shall, option of should it be just a planning board or planning board and an official citizens committee? That would be another option. And then, of course, the option of shall or may in implementation, and sort of annotate this as a draft and see if Jeremy and or Steve could join us at a future meeting. Does that sound like a good idea?
That's a
Yep.
good idea.
Yes.
I'm in.
All right. Yes, Bill.
So Deb, just sort of middle ground here, listening to both Lowry and John's comments, food for thought. And I think it was fleshed out a bit, but since you're going to annotate, maybe a possibility in terms of the composition of the comp plan committee would be identifying that it would be subject to the application process as committees normally are for those other voices that have not been heard through existing committees. And then to the extent that positions are not filled, that the select board would look to the planning board to appoint folks from there. If one of the issues I heard was there's perennially lack of willingness to volunteer for it, maybe you keep it open so that you make the option for new voices to be heard, and then identify that the next step is to look specifically at the planning board. Just a thought when you annotate.
Bill, I think if we're going to talk about a comprehensive plan committee, then we need to address how it's structured. How many members does it have? How long do they serve, et cetera, like we do with all the other committees. And so if we're going to do that, it should probably be in this section.
Right. Well, what if we just put in an option in the annotated version that says one of the options would be a committee appointed by the select board, in which, applicants would, submit the application. And one of the options is just to have it just be the planning board. I mean, we could put that in as the options. And then depending on the kind of feedback we get and the discussion we have, sort of decide what other kind of language we want to put in regarding the structure of the committee itself. Maybe we just want to talk in broad terms with Jeremy and Steve about citizen and planning board versus just planning board, rather than trying to draft language that we might not need.
Sounds like a good idea.
That sounds good.
Okay. Okay, so that's kind of where we are on Article 7. And we've been at this almost an hour. Before we go any further, could we jump to talking about when we might have another meeting so we could then schedule something with Jeremy and Steve? And Bill, would you also like to join the meeting when they come and give us feedback?
I'm happy to. It might help in the sense that I have a little bit of knowledge, which is a dangerous thing, but I'm happy to be there just in case.
Okay. What do you guys think? Do you want to shoot for 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks from 3 weeks? So we do have an extension. So since we can't meet in person yet, I don't know if you know, John, or you know, Bill, how the select board is coming on opening up the French conference room. Have you heard any discussion about when they might be meetings might happen in person?
I think that might depend on the board. I think the select board is at this point anticipating that it will continue with Zooms, but I think that other boards could meet with enough space. I think that would depend on the board or the committee.
I think this one certainly could meet at the public safety building with 6-foot spacing, no problem down there. And we could have a face-to-face.
Yeah, no, we can't, because that can't be televised.
Can't be recorded, John.
Yeah.
Well, can't we space the John French room?
I think we could
Opera House.
if we move chairs out of the way.
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Why don't I talk to, let's try and pick a date, and then I'll talk to the town office about if August is a time where we'll be allowed in.
Deb, why don't you run some numbers by Steve and Bill and Jeremy to see when they all could be in, part of this conversation, and then throw the numbers back at us.
And then I'll run it by the committee. I know that I can't meet after August 19th, because I'm then, if all is well, I'll be out of town until the 7th of September. So if we're going to meet in August, it needs to be by the 19th. So I'll float some dates by Bill, Jeremy, and Steve, or the end of the second week in August, start of the third week in August, and then
Yes.
I wouldn't be able to do it after the 17th of August.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Anybody else have any time constraints?
No, I think the sooner we can do it, the better.
Mhm.
Okay. So no
Deb.
later than August 17th, Karen, is that right? Or is the
Right.
17th out for you?
Well, it's basically out. It's my birthday, so.
Happy birthday.
Well, we could have a cake.
Okay,
Cool.
I'm
Virtu-
there. I'm in.
All right.
All
Deb,
right,
you-
so, yes,
Deb, Bill here, just, if you plan on doing Wednesdays, which is a fine day, I've had, and I still have, many meetings scheduled in this, salmon farm review in Belfast, and they've all been on Wednesdays.
okay,
So, I may have some limitations when you get the schedule, when we get the schedules for Jeremy and Steve. So the one possibility I'm just checking out there is if it's okay with this board, if you feel like I need to be there, it may have to switch to another day.
That's
okey-doke.
fine.
Okay.
That's fine. I'll give them the options of 10th, 11th, 13th, and 14th and see what happens.
Mhm.
Okey
Okay.
doke. All right. How do you guys feel? Do you think that's good for now?
I do.
Enough for tonight?
I do.
I do.
Yep.
Okey doke.
I'm good.
What, John?
I'm good. I said, I'm ready. Time for
Good,
supper.
okey-doke.
Yeah, right.
My next duty is to get in touch with Jeremy and Steve, see if we can pick a night. I'll also find out if we could possibly do it in the French conference room. If not, we'll Zoom it again and get Janice to set that up for us. And by the way, I did hear back from the chairman of the personnel board, just so you guys know. She does have our draft of the section in administrative article, which is 4. And I don't know when, and she's not when she's going to be able to get the personnel board together to talk about our draft. So that is in her hands. Okey doke. Well, all those in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you,
Thanks,
Bill.
Deb.
Thank you, Lowry, Jim, Jean, Karen.
night.
Bye, John. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Aye.